Hello and welcome to Always Remember World War II through Veterans' Eyes. This is our fifth podcast, the 4 combat jumps of All-American Panther Arnold Dutch Nagel. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my young family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the D-Day beaches to the Ardennes forest where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Dachau, and Buchenwald. We saw what was at stake in World War II when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their sacrifices, and I promised to keep their stories alive if they wanted to share any of them with me. I intended to use them in my class, but what I couldn't anticipate was that veterans shared my letters with their buddies and printed them in reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom were Medal of Honor recipients. I had more material than I could ever use in class, so to keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II through Veterans' Eyes and launched this series of podcasts based on the book. Today's podcast features the amazing story of Arnold Dutch Nagel, who completed numerous combat jumps during World War II. Having survived intense fighting in Sicily, Holland, D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Hurtgen Forest, by war's end, Nagel was one of only 3 from Company C, 1st Squad, 1st Platoon of the 505th of the 82nd Airborne Division from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to survive the war. Yet Nagel himself would eventually become perhaps the war's last casualty. Arnold Dutch Nagel of Delphos, Ohio, volunteered for the newly formed parachute troop when he joined the Army in September of 1942 because of the extra $50 per month jump pay they offered. He also wanted one of those distinctive uniforms the paratroopers wore. He did his basic training at Camp Wheeler in Macon, Georgia, before going on to jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia in January of 1943. The training for paratroopers was rigorous. After 3 weeks of calisthenics and jump training, we had to be able to run 5 miles and make 5 jumps in 5 days. In February of 1943, Nagel graduated from jump school and was assigned to Company C, 1st Squad, 1st Platoon, 505th of the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg. While there, Nagel participated in the first regimental mass air jump the U.S. Army ever conducted in March of 1943. The jump was marked by tragedy. One plane in the formation suddenly lost power and sliced through the troopers who had just jumped in front of it, killing 3 troopers. A trooper had the chute cut off his back, and he pulled his reserve chute, and he landed safely. The 3 paratroopers who Nagel saw killed were part of more than 13,000 U.S. airmen who died in basic training in the U.S. before they were ever sent overseas. When the paratroopers left Fort Bragg by train on April 20, 1943 for Camp Edwards in Massachusetts, they were told to remove all identification from our uniforms and hide our boots under leggings so we look like regular infantry. Less than a week after arriving at Fort Bragg, the 82nd became the first Airborne Division to serve on foreign soil when it boarded the USS Monterey on April 28, 1943, for North Africa. As British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's urging, President Franklin D. Roosevelt agreed to make North Africa the first major campaign of the U.S. forces in the European theater. Over the strong objections of his most senior commanders, President Roosevelt agreed to the operation in July 1942. No matter where they looked, successes were few and far between for the Allies in mid-1942. German U-boats were inflicting appalling damage to Allied shipments throughout the Atlantic. German General Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps was advancing on the Suez Canal, while on the Eastern Front the Germans threatened Stalingrad, and in the Pacific the Japanese continued their expansion, building a defensive perimeter around the newly acquired empire. President Roosevelt hoped a victory in North Africa would give the shaken American public a much-needed boost of morale. On November 8, 1942, Operation Torch used 500 warships and 350 transports to deliver approximately 125,000 British and American troops to Casablanca, Morocco. Under the control of Vichy France, the Allies had hoped the French would greet them in North Africa. Instead, 2 days of intense fighting took place, and the Allies agreed to allow Vichy Admiral François Darlan to remain in power before the Vichy French government ordered all French forces in Algeria and Morocco to cease their hostilities towards the Allied soldiers. As a result, Allied losses were kept relatively low, with 500 dead and 700 wounded. Instead of building morale, though, Operation Torch left many Americans angered that a supposed ally had fought against them. Arnold Dutch Nagel and his fellow paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division were none too impressed with the living conditions they found in Morocco, especially Ouija, the city the airborne traveled to 12 days after arriving at Casablanca in the summer of 1943. It was a dirty Arab town, soon named the Dust Bowl by us. We made only one training jump at Ouija because we suffered so many injuries we couldn't risk more. Most training took place at night, as the day temperatures were 115 to 120 degrees in the shade, and there were no shade trees. It was too hot to sleep in pup tents during the day, so we didn't sleep much during this time. Lister bags were hung out in the sun on tripods between our tents, and this is where we got the water to fill our canteens. The water was always warm and chlorinated so heavily that it would burn our throats. Because of the heat, dirt, flies, and unsanitary conditions, it wasn't long before everyone had some form of dysentery. Nagel spent 2 months in North Africa before the 505th was chosen to lead the invasion of Sicily. The success of Operation Torch gave the Allies a foothold in North Africa, from which they launched an invasion of southern Italy. The Allies anticipated that an invasion of southern Italy would force the Germans to amass their armies there, instead of in northern France, where another Allied invasion was planned for some time in 1944. The Italian campaign would become the most protracted and costly fought in the Western theater during World War II. On the night of July 9, 1943, C-47s flew 3,400 paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division to the southeast corner of Sicily, where the Allied beach landings were to take place. To avoid radar detection, the C-47s flew at 200 feet until they reached Sicily. Once the island was spotted, the C-47s climbed to 700 feet, the jump height of the airborne. Gale force winds of up to 38 miles per hour played havoc on the paratroopers, who had trained in winds that were just 10 to 12 miles per hour to prevent injuries. In the gusty winds, 3 C-47s fell out of formation, and since they couldn't find the designated island drop zone, returned instead to Morocco. Sicily was the first combat jump for the 82nd Airborne Division, which was under the command of Colonel Jumpin' Jim Gavin. The paratroopers quickly learned that combat conditions were not the same as training conditions, as Arnold Dutch Nagel recalled. Combat jump conditions were nothing like practice jump conditions for many obvious reasons. The pilots did not slow down when we jumped in combat because of the anti-aircraft fire. As soon as the pilot jumped all the troopers in his plane, he headed for better skies on his way back to the airfield. But we were to jump regardless. If our plane was hit, we were to jump as soon as we could, or before the plane went down. When the pilot turned the red light on, we stood and we hooked up. When he turned the green light on, we jumped. The planes rocked back and forth because the anti-aircraft shells were exploding around them. Some troopers lost their footing before they jumped, and because of the weight and the bulk we were carrying, we had to help them back to their feet. We had no control once we jumped from the plane. We landed wherever, in a tree, in a river, on a roof, on a road. We had to make the best of the circumstances we found ourselves in. I had my first combat jump, and I landed safely. Nagel's mission in Sicily had been to take out some of the pillboxes in Gela. Because of the strong winds and poor visibility, the paratroopers were scattered badly, and few got anywhere near their intended drop zone. Instead of dropping over Gela, Nagel landed some 60 miles away in Avola, Sicily. But at least he was alive and uninjured. Many of the paratroopers had sustained broken legs, ankles, or hips from Sicily's rocky, hilly terrain. Once on the ground, Nagel knew the enemy would be looking for him. The paratrooper was most vulnerable when they were still covered with their chute. An Italian patrol quickly spotted Nagel. "The Italian patrol came to find me, but I heard them coming. I got out of my chute and I moved approximately 75 feet off to the right while putting my M1 rifle together and hiding behind a stone wall. When we landed, we were nearly helpless with our M1 rifle apart and in a case. It was dark and someone was out to kill you or take you prisoner while you were still in your parachute." Although .45 caliber pistols were promised to the paratroopers and would have come in handy for protection upon landing, they were only ever issued to officers and a few sergeants. Nagel managed to elude the Italian patrol, and by morning he had joined up with 75 other troopers, all from different companies. The ragtag troop went on to capture the town of Avola and buried their dead with the help of the prisoners they took. Friendly fire is a concern of any soldier and cost the lives of untold Allied soldiers during World War II. Nagel recalled that on the night of July 11, 1943, the 504th Regiment was supposed to jump in Sicily to reinforce the 505th, when they instead became victims of friendly fire. "On their way down, and they had 23 planes shot down by the U.S. Navy and Army, who were already at sea and on shore. Most of those troopers were killed. As much as we hate to tell this story, this type of tragedy did happen. Lack of communications or one error in judgment, and many lives could be innocently lost. In this instance, our own planes were thought to be the planes of the enemy, and they were shot down by our own forces." Nagel himself would later become the target of friendly fire when P-38 bombers mistakenly dropped 500-pound bombs on the troopers as they tried to take a hill near Volturno River in south-central Italy. Following the capture of Avola, Nagel's company marched onward towards Gela, Sicily, in their original mission, which was still some 60 miles away. As they marched in the Sicilian heat, they came to appreciate the quality of the Italian water, which tasted much better than what they had in North Africa. They also found new use for their parachutes, as mosquito netting and as a lining for their foxholes. One of the troopers blew up an Italian bank safe in a town along the way. The trooper shared the spoils with his buddies. "All of us had pockets full of money, but we didn't think it was any good, so we used it to build fires, cook coffee, and heat water for shaving and washing." Before the paratroopers could reach Gela, they were ordered back to North Africa to prepare for a jump over Rome itself. That jump was canceled, though, and the paratroopers did not jump again until September 15, 1943, over Salerno Bay in Italy. At Salerno Bay, they took Hell 420, deep in enemy territory, reducing pressure on the 504th, which was fighting to capture a town. Another jump soon followed at Maiori, Italy, where the paratroopers had a beach landing so that they could march on to help liberate Naples. Once Naples was liberated, Nagel's company was asked to occupy and police the city. The company enjoyed having a proper roof over their heads for the first time in months, as they occupied abandoned government buildings. The troopers also enjoyed the 3 meals a day they received from their company cooks. On November 18, 1943, Nagel's company left Italy aboard the USS Frederick Funston, arriving back to Oran, North Africa, 4 days later. The troopers stayed on the ship in Oran as it waited to form a convoy to Belfast, Ireland. By December 9, 1943, the paratroopers arrived in Belfast, Ireland. The paratroopers spent the next 6 months training, first at Cookstown, North Ireland, later at Leicester, England, training for what would become the Normandy invasion. Arnold Dutch Nagel was already a combat veteran then by the time he jumped just outside of Sainte Mere Eglise, France on D-Day. His 505th was the only airborne unit participating in the D-Day invasion with past combat experience. Nagel recalled the equipment the paratroopers carried that nearly doubled the weight of most paratroopers. Each trooper carried 150 pounds or more of equipment when he jumped. The equipment consisted of a rifle, a Tommy gun or bar between a rifle and a machine gun, 160 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition, 2 hand grenades, and 1 gammon grenade. The order was to carry a landmine with detonator and safety clip in place. The possibility was always there of the detonator being hit by a bullet and exploding, killing the trooper carrying it. After the jumps in Sicily, in which the paratroopers jumped with their M1 rifles apart and in a case, leaving them defenseless upon landing, orders changed, and by D-Day, paratroopers jumped with their M1s together and fully loaded. Unbeknownst to the paratroopers, the German division that was defending the peninsula had manipulated the gate locks of the dam, controlling the Murderate River, causing it to swell from its normal width of 30 feet to 600 feet or more. Nagel recalled a murderous Murderate River. Some of the troopers drowned because of the heavy load they were carrying. They were not able to get out of their chute harness and heavy load fast enough. Landings were always dangerous, even without the flooding hazard. 4 men from Nagel's platoon of roughly 24 men were injured just in the landing. First Lieutenant Washika of the 1st Platoon told us before we jumped in Normandy to stick with him and he would get us all medals. That same lieutenant broke both his ankles on the jump, and that was the last I saw of him for 20 years. If they survived the landing, paratroopers were ordered to find the equipment bundles that the C-47s dropped from their cargo chutes. Each equipment bundle included machine guns, bazookas, and mortars. Paratroopers were told to assemble at the equipment bundle and were not allowed to search for anyone missing at the time of assembly. They were issued toy crickets, but the Germans quickly became aware of them, making them too dangerous to use. Nagel's mission was to hold the Lafayette Bridge on the Murderate River. This prevented the Germans from sending reinforcements to Sainte Mere Eglise to stop the beach landings. After taking out a German truck along the way, the paratroopers reached the bridge by daylight. They were determined to keep those Germans from crossing that bridge. No sooner did Nagel get across the river at the bridge than a German soldier started shooting at him. I ducked behind a big tree. I had a Tommy gun, and the German had a burp gun. That German was like a jack-in-the-box. He kept popping his head up and shooting at me while moving back and forth. We shot at each other, and I got a couple of holes in my coat and a crease in my canteen cup. All at once he stopped shooting, so I quickly left the tree to go back to where I had come from. I don't know what happened to him. The Germans tried to defend the bridge with Tiger tanks, which the infantry knew were equipped with 88s, one of the most powerful guns in the war. If you heard an 88 go off, Nagel explained, it was too late to duck because it was already behind you, and you were lucky enough to be alive. Fortunately, the infantry's bazookas managed to knock out 3 of the Tiger tanks, causing the others to withdraw. But still the Germans hammered Nagel's paratroopers with mortar fire throughout the rest of the day. During the barrage of mortar fire, Nagel's life was saved by another paratrooper who was hit directly in front of him. I was behind a wall at the bridge when the German fired a barrage of mortar shells. A trooper came running with a bazooka ammunition, and he knelt down in front of me. A German shell exploded, and it filled his back with shrapnel. If that soldier would not have been in front of me, that shrapnel would have filled my chest. I don't know whatever happened to him, because he was not in my company, and I have no way of finding out. Nagel was shot, and he was nearly killed just 9 days after D-Day on June 15, 1944. Nagel had been chosen by a lieutenant from 2nd Platoon, along with 4 or 5 others from his company, to attack some Germans who were in a hedgerow by an apple orchard. As the GIs reached the opposite hedgerow, the tanks that were supposed to cover them failed to show up. The GIs attacked anyway. One German shot the helmet off of Nagel's head. It spun on the ground like a top, as Nagel quickly retrieved it, placing it back on his head. As he did so, 2 Germans came out of the hedgerow, their arms up, indicating their surrender. "I took them prisoner, and about the same time I was shot right above the knee. I think I was shot and not killed because I took those 2 Germans prisoner and had not killed them. My prisoners helped me back to the apple orchard, of course. I had my Tommy gun on them. Our medics bandaged me by the tanks that had never moved to cover us. The medics put me on a stretcher, and my 2 prisoners carried me back to the aid station. I would have hated the lieutenant that sent me to get shot, but when I reached the aid station, that lieutenant was already there. He was shot before I was. I think my prisoners felt as I did, just relieved that this battle was over for us and that we were the survivors." Nagel would be given a short respite from the war. He was sent back to a hospital in England, where doctors also found a small piece of either a bullet or his helmet still in his head. Nagel would spend the next 2 months recuperating before he parachuted into combat again on September 17, 1944, at Groesbeek, Holland. The Operation Market Garden jump in Holland was Nagel's first daylight combat jump and almost became his last. As he landed in an open field, a German soldier came out of the woods. Nagel was still helpless, struggling to take off his parachute. He was an easy target. "The soldier looked at me, and I looked at him. He turned and he disappeared in the woods. He could have shot me, but he knew that if he shot me, my buddies would have shot him. There is some honor in all soldiers. I guess they didn't want to die any more than we did, and if they had a choice, they chose to live that day also." A few days later, 3 other paratroopers in Nagel's squad, 2 of them combat replacements taking part in their first combat jump, were not so lucky. As they were on a hill, German soldiers began shelling them with screaming meanies. The rocket launchers made a terrible screeching sound as they were fired, hence their name. "We all jumped in our foxholes, and when it exploded, it made the ground shake. The 2 replacements jumped in the same hole, and a shell landed right in their hole. They never had a chance. My friend Raymond, he had his rifle laying crosswire in his hole, and when he jumped in the hole, he could not get all the way down fast enough, and the shrapnel killed him. He only had part of his shoulder and his head sticking out. A very innocent and a very costly mistake." Despite the shelling and the casualties they suffered, Nagel's squad did not give up the hill, and they held it until they were relieved and sent back to their company. As 1944 drew to a close, it seemed that the Allies had the Nazis on the run everywhere. British Field Marshal Montgomery declared confidently on December 15th, "The enemy is at present fighting a defensive campaign on all fronts. His situation is such that he cannot stage any major offensive operations." Montgomery could not have been more wrong. Within a day of his remarks, the Germans mounted their longest counteroffensive yet on the Western Front. 30 divisions amassed along a line of 80 miles from Monschau, Germany in the north, to Echternach, Luxembourg in the south, with 1,000 tanks and about 1,500 aircraft. Amazingly, the Germans had assembled 500,000 troops. Allied reinforcements were rushed in to defend the Ardennes forest. Even troops back home in the U.S. found they were reassigned. Eventually, the Americans assembled some 600,000 U.S. soldiers to oppose the Germans. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. Initially, the German assault was a great success, aided by bad weather and the lack of Allied air support. The Allied forces were pushed back as far west as 480 miles from their original positions. Arnold Dutch Nagel remembered the Battle of the Bulge's heavy snowfall and extreme cold. His 505th of the 82nd Airborne Division had been rushed by truck into Belgium to support the GIs who were under siege there. Nagel recalled none of them were prepared for the brutal weather. On December 22nd, the temperature dropped and it began to snow again. It snowed at least 12 inches. On the occasions when the temperature fell below zero, it was a constant struggle to keep hands, feet, and ears from freezing. We had to sleep in the snow, and we slept with all we could possibly have on to keep from freezing, as we had no shelter. When Nagel's paratroopers first arrived, they had no blankets or overcoats, just their M43 jumpsuit and boots. Their uniforms amounted to little more than summer clothing in one of the most bitter cold and wet winters in Belgium. Because they had been transported by truck at this time, we didn't even have our parachutes to keep us warm. When the GIs took turns sleeping, Nagel recalled the soldier on guard would cover them with a blanket, and we would sleep in rows and change places on the ends to try to keep warm. If the soldiers were lucky enough to spend the night near a tank, they used the exhaust heat from the tank to keep warm. Still, if the conditions were bad, the many lumps in the snow, dead American and German soldiers, were a sobering reminder that things could always be worse. Fortunately, after a few days, Nagel recalled, we received our overcoats, sleeping bags, shoe packs, blankets, and winter gloves. When he received his sleeping bag, Nagel found he could keep his canteen thawed by placing it alongside him in his sleeping bag. During an attack, the soldiers often had to leave their blankets, their sleeping bags, and the overcoats behind. If we were not able to go back and get them, we wouldn't have them again until our engineers would bulldoze the road through and bring them to us. Frostbitten toes were an ever-present fear during the Battle of the Bulge. To avoid frostbite, the soldiers changed their socks as much as they could, and they slept with their boots on. Still, many soldiers were shipped out due to frostbite. Nagel quickly learned in the fighting at the Bulge that shrapnel from the woods could be just as dangerous as the enemy's artillery. They shot trajectory fire. It would explode in the treetops, blow the tops off the trees, and the shrapnel was disastrous. On January 3, 1945, the 505th suffered more casualties in one day than any other day in the entire war. By January 25, 1945, the German soldiers had been pushed back to the positions they initially held before the attack. The Germans had lost 100,000 soldiers in the attack, soldiers that the Germans could not replace. The Allies lost 80,000, but they had replacements readily available. Arnold Dutch Nagel's paratroopers received a well-deserved rest after weeks of fighting in the snow. They were taken to Belgium, where they stayed in Belgium homes, ate hot food, and had their first showers in 3 weeks. They needed the rest too, because they were sent to the still raging inferno, the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, next. Paratrooper Arnold Dutch Nagel was busy trying to stop the German advance at the Battle of the Bulge when the Hurtgen Forest had begun. On January 26, 1945, we were sent to the Hurtgen Forest. This place was heavily wooded and boggy, with irregular terrain and steep cliffs and gullies. German engineers had sown landmines in the fields across most of the zone. Heavy wire entanglements blocked most routes. The only way to get troops through was on foot. The snow was about 2 feet deep, and if you couldn't carry it, you didn't have it. We walked in columns of twos, and we took turns breaking trail because the snow was so deep you were just worn out after a time. The heavy snowstorms, freezing rain, and bitter cold added up to heavy casualties for both sides. Neither the Americans nor the Germans were fully equipped to handle the harsh winter conditions. Soldiers of both sides lacked warm enough boots and socks for their feet and had inadequate winter clothing or blankets. As a result, it wasn't uncommon to find both German and American soldiers frozen to death in the woods. Even the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans' surprise offensive in the Ardennes, which began on December 16th, wasn't enough to stop the Hurricane Forest meat grinder. While the Battle of the Bulge certainly diverted both German and American troops to the Ardennes, the fighting in the Hurricane Forest sputtered on until February 23, 1945. By then, the Hurricane had claimed over 30,000 American casualties and some 28,000 German casualties. Afterwards, both sides seemed anxious to forget the inferno that was the Hurricane Forest. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, he barely mentioned the fighting there in Crusade in Europe, his history of the war. Perhaps Major James Gavin said it best when he concluded bitterly, "For us, the Hurricane Forest was one of the most costly, most unproductive, and most ill-advised battles that our army has ever fought." Arnold Dutch Nagel of Delphos, Ohio, recalled that as the war wound down, the older men in his paratrooper company became anxious because they didn't want to be killed or drowned at war's end. After 2 years of combat and 4 combat jumps, the idea of getting killed was a little bitter to contemplate. With the end of the war in sight, death, when it came, seemed especially cruel. Friendly fire nearly killed Nagel a week before VE Day. His C Company had to cross the Elbe River in Germany on April 30th, 1945. The river, some 400 yards in width, was to be crossed in a flimsy assault boats, and the soldiers had to paddle themselves. As C Company crossed, they were mistaken for Germans, and they had friendly fire dropped on them. After the crossing, Company C was attacked by some Germans still willing to die for the Führer or the fatherland. The Germans used 20mm anti-aircraft guns, like machine guns, firing directly at us. Even though they had survived the war, many GIs didn't feel like celebrating when it ended. After nearly 30 months overseas on 2 continents, involving 6 campaigns and 7 river crossings, Nagel knew his parachute regiment had paid a terrible price. Of his original squad, which had made 4 combat jumps during the long war, there were only 3 of us left from the squad. Company C, 1st Squad, 1st Platoon from Fort Bragg. They were Gerald Cosgrove, Aso Fisher, and myself, Arnold Nagel. Each of us had been in the hospital at least once. Having experienced so much senseless slaughter, some GIs struggled with survival guilt and couldn't understand why they had survived the war when so many of their buddies had perished. As they tried to make sense of it all, some soldiers attributed their survival to divine intervention, to a guardian angel, the Virgin Mary, Jesus, or God, watching over them throughout their combat. Others attributed survival to their training or to the skills of their fellow brothers in arms. After seeing so many of their buddies die in combat, even more returning veterans seemed to credit their survival, as Dutch Nagel did, to good luck. "I don't know how we survived it. It had to be luck, or it was God's will. Nobody can train you how to stay alive in a war. They can't teach you. They can't tell you. Some of it is just plain luck, good or bad." His service in World War II was never far from the thoughts of Dutch Nagel. When he was married shortly after returning to the States, his young bride wore a wedding dress made from the reserve parachute from his jump in Holland. When his daughters were baptized, they each wore baptismal dresses made from the same parachute. Painful wartime memories were challenging to block out, but still veterans tried as best as they could as a coping mechanism when they returned home. Dutch Nagel probably spoke for many when he wrote, "Some things are meant to be forgotten. They are too painful to write or talk about. I tried to forget for many, many years. It is not easy to think about nor try to remember. It is very difficult to explain my feelings. Only those who fought beside me can truly understand what they went through." For Nagel, like so many other veterans, the World War II anniversary celebrations commemorating the 40th, 45th, and 50th anniversaries of the war prompted him to come to terms with those memories and to begin talking about his experiences. World War II veterans, Then, in their late 70s and early 80s, new time was running out, and they felt a duty to share their memories, especially of buddies long since dead. For veterans like Dutch Nagel, speaking the names of his long-dead buddies kept their memories alive. Nagel could never forget, and he didn't want future generations to either, the sacrifice of GIs like Mike Sgambarelli, who had been one of the most popular men of C Company and who was also fluent in Italian. Sgambarelli was captured by Italians the moment he hit the ground. For some reason, perhaps because he was Italian, an Italian officer had Sgambarelli tied up and emptied his pistol into him at point-blank range. When this didn't kill him, the Italians then threw his own grenades at him as he lay on the ground. Miraculously, Sgambarelli survived and was found by a medic who had him evacuated to a British hospital ship off Syracuse, Sicily. The ship was struck by German bombers and was sunk. Sgambarelli survived even the sinking, but soon died in the hospital. His iron constitution couldn't cope with all his grievous wounds and the exposure from the sinking ship. As the World War II anniversaries approached, Nagel became active in the Return to Normandy Veterans Group. He was invited to have breakfast with President Clinton at the White House on Veterans Day, November 11, 1994. Nagel participated in jumps marking both the 45th and 50th anniversaries of Operation Market Garden in Holland in 1989 and in 1994, as well as for the 50th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy. He even made one jump he was especially proud of in Indiana in 1992 with his 2 grandsons. When I moved back to Rockford in the year 2000, I again started writing to Nagel, and he invited me to visit him and his wife in Delphos, Ohio, about 300 miles away. He promised to show me his collection of World War II artifacts, but sadly, our visit never happened. In August of that year, his 78 years of age, Nagel joined several of his World War II buddies in what sadly became his last jump. Marking the opening of the Airborne and Special Operations Museum in nearby Fayetteville, the jump was held at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where Nagel's World War II service had begun with the 82nd Airborne Division. Nagel told his buddies that he had a bad feeling just before he jumped, but he wasn't going to let them down. He jumped anyhow. Nagel's parachute malfunctioned, causing an especially hard landing that triggered a fatal heart attack. After his death, Nagel's fellow veterans from the Return to Normandy Association gathered at the museum to remember him. "We all feel the same way. We would like to go the way Dutch went, quickly and without a lot of pain," Richard Mandick, president of the group, said on behalf of his buddies. Howard Greenberg, a fellow paratrooper buddy from Ohio, said of him, "Dutch is a most unspoken guy. He takes no credit for what he did in the war. He had 4 combat jumps. He captured several prisoners, but he would just say that I just was following orders." Nagel probably wouldn't have wanted to go any other way, and his last jump was a true honor and celebration of all those men that he served with and his buddies in World War II. This podcast is dedicated to Chris Tolfer, whose grandfather was the first cousin of Arnold Dutch Nagel. Tolfer now serves in the exact company Arnold Dutch Nagel was in, C Company, 505th 82nd Airborne Division. Tolfer is currently stationed down in North Carolina at Fort Bragg, where Nagel's paratrooper service began and sadly ended. Tolfer wrote me, "I solely joined the Army to be in the exact unit he was in, and thankfully I made that happen." Tolfer even participated in this year's D-Day anniversaries at Sainte Mere Eglise, France. Nothing would have made Nagel prouder. If you liked this podcast, please leave a review and follow us. New podcasts come out weekly, bi-weekly. Please visit my webpage for additional episodes and for additional pictures and articles about Arnold Dutch Nagel and the other veterans in my podcasts. Also, if you're interested, you can check out the book on Amazon.com. Today's song was I Remember You by Jimmy Dorsey. Thank you again for listening.